Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast.
Welcome to the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. This is part 2 of a series that I call The Sins of Silicon Valley. Part 2 is going to be a contrast to part 1, which was an abstraction of all the things at a macro level that I see wrong with Silicon Valley, and explaining that there's nothing wrong with technology. It's really the culture of technology, especially American Silicon Valley, West Coast technology companies. But the truth is the problem is actually older than that. And anyway, in part 2, I'm going to be drilling down on specific companies and specific examples of things that they are doing that are wrong, and specific things that we can do to not do that anymore. Every single major tech company at this point has what I would call sins. Violations of moral and social compact that are things that make society function. And so far as I know, none of them are necessary, right? Each of these companies that I'm going to be talking about did not have to do this, right? You could have Facebook without privacy violations or without allowing and fostering hate speech. These companies are so big and so profitable that they could have taken reasonable steps early on to prevent pretty much everything I'm going to talk about. In fact, if I can, I'll even talk about what they could have done before they even started to prevent these problems, and more importantly, what we as a society can do to clean up their mess. As you can see, likely from the title of this episode, this first episode is starting with somebody older than companies we know today, but they're still around, IBM, right? You may not know a lot about IBM, but when you think about IBM, you think of technology, and you think of prestige, and you think of, a Fortune 500 company that's been around for well on close to 100 years, and they are a very old company, and they have done a lot of valuable work in the advancement of computers. The first computer was arguably either created by the Greeks millennia ago or by Charles Babbage in the 19th century. But in terms of, actual computers as we know them today, IBM was a heavyweight in making them actually distributed to the populace at large. Certainly most major American computers and what we thought of as computers were created and controlled by IBM prior to the computer revolution in the 70s and 80s, and we'll get to that with Microsoft. The reason I'm bringing up IBM in particular is because, based on what I can observe, the first technological macro sin was committed by IBM during World War II. So there was an individual by the name of Edwin Black who put out a book in 2001 about research that he had done about a heinous crime that had pretty much slipped through the cracks, and which, to this day, pretty much IBM still denies. So, super quick history lesson. Germany, which was brought to its knees at the end of World War I by the Allied powers, which was primarily the United States and the United States and France and England. By then, Russia was out of the war. And to a lesser extent, I guess, Japan, because they were an ally in World War I, and a few other countries. Basically, Germany was crushed. And the war was very hard for everybody on both sides, but specifically England and France were just livid at Germany, and they wanted to take it out in their hide, right? So they basically against the wishes of KKK supporting left-wing President Woodrow Wilson. The man is complicated. He had a lot of good things and a lot of bad things, but he definitely supported the KKK. But in this case, he was on the side of the right, where he was trying to champion the League of Nations, which was an early attempt at the UN and didn't work. And he was also attempting to keep this pernicious concept of reparations from entering World War I, or entering post-war Germany. And, basically, for a while, the reformers had the cock of the walk in Germany, right? It was they had one of the most liberal, fantastic constitutions in the era. They attempted to reform their entire society and take a culture that was already very pro-science and very inclined to be forward-thinking and push it even farther. And so, among other things that they did in the interest of transparency was institute a culture of extreme record-keeping. Those of you who may or may not have heard about the Nazis and how, and how extreme it was that of all the meticulous records they kept was a combination of hubris and the belief that they really would have a 1,000-year Reich and wanted to preserve these records for posterity, but also a well-meaning, transparent, progressive movement that was actually global and repeated in a lot of Western countries for record-keeping and transparency and freedom of information. And part of that, right, part of this whole process and this modernization so that Germany would not become what it was under Bismarck in 1917 that had caused them to lose the war, was this interest in automating and having, cutting, bleeding-edge science. A lot of people forget that, broadly speaking, in World War II, Germany had a technological edge over, the Allies, right? They had the rockets, they had jet fighters in World War II, right? The Enigma machine, which several well-done movies have shown, that it wasn't just superior to what the Allies had in a lot of ways. It was also widely distributed, right? The Enigma company was adopted early in German culture as a way to send encrypted, coded messages among all of the German command. And it proved to, and the Germans kept improving on it, And it took basically the next level up from Turing in computation to break it. And it's a good thing we did too, because the war probably would have been much longer and much bloodier if we hadn't. But the fact of the matter is that while all this is going on, right, IBM is also part of this same cultural movement that's been set up in Germany to have census records to count and keep records of everything, right? IBM at the time was the world's foremost expert on counting and tabulation machines. So in other words, take a census of things, and Germany was an extreme example of this. They, like I said, they kept records of everything, and those records were collated and analyzed and meticulously reviewed by the German authorities. And in the Weimar Republic, that was an attempt for transparency and all the left-wing progressive ideals. But when the German fascist centrists / right-wing government took over, because anybody who thinks that Germany was a left-wing government can go stick their head in a toilet, the fact of the matter is that they kept doing it, right? So in other words, IBM had huge contracts and did huge business with Germany in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and afterwards. And, anybody who understands American history understands that there was a circle of thought in the West in general, but in particular among American businessmen, that fascism was a third way, where have you heard that before, by the way, that term third way, was a response to the populist movements of either capitalism of either democracy or communism, right? It was something else that would allow you to control and govern a nation in these perilous post-industrial times that would work, right? So there were a ton of Americans that were American businessmen that were fascinated by the very idea of fascism, and IBM basically, to summarize the crime, kept doing business with Germany well after the war. Well, okay, that by itself isn't necessarily a crime. Lots of bad people have profited from wars and are lauded now as, philanthropists rather than robber barons. But the thing is that IBM actually had a role in the actual Holocaust, right? So, in other words, Nazi Germany, being Nazi Germany, kept records of everything. In fact, to be honest, if you're familiar with European culture in general and European record keeping, by the way, the concept of keeping records of everything in the interest of transparency is still very much a European thing. Europe has better record keeping than, so far as I know, any other region on the planet. And so that didn't really go away. There's nothing wrong with keeping records and tabulating them. However, IBM was basically keeping records on Holocaust victims and helping track what was going on with these guys, right? Now, the fact of the matter is that parts of the company were taken over by the Nazi government, right? And fascism is very much a transparent line. The line between the government and business becomes insanely thin, and it's not exactly like American businessmen were theoretically running this, right? So it might have had the name IBM on it, but it was effectively actually run by Germans or sympathetic fascist Europeans such as Poland, which has tried to deny any role in the Holocaust whatsoever, because, of course, Poland is currently controlled by a fascist regime. That basically all this stuff is going on, and the thing is that IBM might not have had, American executives over in Europe running the IBM company, but the fact of the matter is that it was still IBM machines, and more importantly, here's the real kicker, and this is why IBM is definitely culpable here. These machines were sold to Germany, but the service contract was still controlled by IBM. In other words, these calculating and tabulation machines were never actually officially owned by their customers, right? The German government did not own IBM machines. They were leased. And this is a business model that still happens in a lot of technological companies and a lot of places now. They don't sell their machines, they lease them. And the reason they lease them is so that they can maintain the service contract. In fact, even now that IBM is not really in the regular computer game anymore, they have some projects like Deep Blue. But the fact of the matter is, IBM still makes most of its money through business contracts. And the fact is that the German government not only used IBM punch card technology and kept these meticulous records of who was where and what they did, there's an argument to be made that the Holocaust would not have been possible on the scale that it was. Because here's the thing, right? Lots of evil governments have killed people they don't like before, right? There is nothing new about this. And unfortunately, people being people, we're probably going to do this until we evolve or the machines take over. I have no idea. What I do know is that, last year, the government of Myanmar basically had the Rohingyas, a Muslim minority, systemically purged by its basically fascist military, which was tolerated by the democratic government in the interests of maintaining democracy, which, by the way, as of February 14th, they've lost, right? In other words, there's been a coup in Myanmar, and by attempting to appease this fascist military that wanted to kill all the people that it didn't like, they lost. And the fact of the matter is that there are tons and tons of examples, the Khmer Rouge, Stalin, and the mass purging of a lot of these people. But the reason the Holocaust is, the Holocaust, despite attempts to minimize it or compare it to conservative suffering from social media self-corrections in the American culture, is because the Holocaust killed more people, and more importantly, it was blatantly state-sponsored, and it was meticulously organized. In other words, a whole lot of people died in Russia, and Stalin was a monster. But nobody, and I mean nobody, is as insanely organized about how they did it compared to the way the Nazis did it, right? They kept records. They made the trains run on time. They knew who was what and where and what their capacity of extermination was, and maintenance records for the extermination machines. Governments have killed millions of people before, and governments will continue to do it. But the full scope of state involvement, essentially as an industry of genocide, is completely unique to Nazi Germany. Nobody, including Stalin and the Communist Party, or even the American government and its killing of Indians, was as meticulous and vicious as Nazi Germany. And part of what made that industrial, factory, vicious, genocidal slaughter possible was IBM and its ability to track all of these people and who they were and what they were doing, and creating a nice little organized schedule to facilitate genocide, right? When IBM set up business in Germany, right, did they, say, I think these machines might be used for genocide, but I'm okay with that, right? When they started off early, if you expect me to believe that they expected that to happen, of course they didn't, right? But the thing is that IBM serviced these machines, right? They had experts that helped run and maintain these incredibly complicated machines. And Nazi Germany did not appear out of nowhere, right? It took a full decade of very obvious handwriting on the wall, kind of like what we have in the United States of America with the sedition/GOP party. It was obvious to anyone that was involved that Germany was a problem, and it was only becoming more and more of a problem, and IBM still did nothing, right? So when we look at the arrogance and the negligence or the half-assed measures of American technology companies, we can point to IBM and say IBM knew that Germany was a problem, knew that they were a fascist regime, knew that these machines were being used in ways that were just gross, and did nothing. Right? Now, can I point to any individual executive in IBM and said, this guy is the architecture of how this worked? No, I can't. It's in fact, if anything, the paper trail and the trail of culpability is a lot clearer in the sense of what American technology companies are doing. That's not why I'm bringing this up. And by the way, IBM has basically pretty much gotten away scot-free. There's been a few token reparations that they've had to make. But for the most part, they've denied everything, or they've used the statute of limitations defense or ambiguity as to who exactly specifically in the company knew this. But the thing is that this is a company that has the benefits of the corporate legal shield, which means that IBM investors are able to enjoy a charter from multiple democracies to reduce the risk of investors, in theory, because they do some public good. But the fact of the matter is that it's clear that when you're involved in genocide, your public good, that charter should have been revoked a long time ago, and yet IBM is still around and is still doing their thing. And it's been so long, Tom, that, no. Genocide is not something that ever washes away, right? IBM, as long as it exists, is going to have the stain of genocide on them. And there's no forgiveness of that. There's no culpability. IBM still has the same name, right? Did they even change the name? ValueJet, which in the 1990s had a horrific crash because they were idiots and brought a bunch of oxygen tanks that weren't properly secured on a plane and blew up, right? Changed their name, right? They're a different air company now. They're still around under a different name. Feel free to look it up yourself. But the fact of the matter is that companies change their name all the time. Heck, even Blackwater changed their name, right? When you have your mercenaries involved in war crimes, which Trump later pardons because he's evil and Republicans are evil. I'm sorry, conservatives are, it's your argument where there's always, there's the one good conservative or, there's the one good Republican. By the way, the supposedly good conservatives, the Lincoln Project, recently had some sexual crimes come to light. So, I guess not all conservatives or not all Republicans, right? But, if you were involved in the party of Trump, at some point, the name of the Republican Party becomes so tarnished. Would you join the Nazi Party? Would you say, I'm going to join the Nazi Party? Right? At some point, a name becomes so tarnished that association with it is a problem, right? And at some point, a name like IBM, when you're associated with genocide and you're not taking full ownership, and they haven't even changed the freaking name because the name is synonymous with technology and business and reliability. And so the brand of the name IBM is huge, and worth a lot of money. But the fact of the matter is that it's tainted with genocide. And the lesson here, folks, isn't that IBM needs to go away, although in my opinion, especially after talking this out, it should be. The lesson here is that unless these tech companies step up and own their mistakes, they're going to be the next IBM, right? Facebook or Google or Microsoft or Amazon or even Apple are going to be involved in these horrific crimes against humanity or against future digital intelligence. Because, how could we have foreseen? They could foresee. They could foresee. There is no crime that has been committed by an American technology company that could not have been foreseen had reasonable steps been taken. But the people that run these companies and the people that profit from them and the people that look away and let them get away with the things they get away with do it because they're greedy. It's just the way it is. This has been the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. Buy my book, Have Name Will Travel, at Amazon and other markets. RedAnvilCreative.com contains all our podcasts. Copyright 2021.
To fight the forces of evil!